Alright, so we're going to talk about operations today. This section of your business plan, as I've discussed before, each section of the business plan has a goal, and this one is to convince the reader that you can execute. So you need to be able to talk about what you're actually going to do in the company, which we call operations, and try to, in doing so, identify where you have an advantage and show you that you've done the homework, that it's clear, they can understand it. And all of the stuff that you do in operations, as you think through all of those details, all of those flow through to the financials. So you'll probably be working back and forth between the operations and the financials. Operations will help you think of what you need to for startup and fixed costs and variable costs. And it would be really helpful if you use graphics to illustrate and describe your operations. And I'm going to give you some examples of just kind of the idea of what I'm talking about. And you can also look at some of the example business plans on Web Campus that I've linked to. This isn't an operations and procedure manual, but you would do that if you were actually starting the business. You'd want to come up with a manual. So again, you want to show that you can actually execute, and this is what you're doing. Here's some very simple diagrams. If you're trying to explain Uber Eats rather, this is a diagram that's really helpful to just explain what Uber Eats does. You could try to do it in words, but it's just a lot more clear if you have a diagram. Here's another diagram that that is pretty easy about how you do the business model for a bike rental company. Okay, so again, you could try to do this with paragraph form, bullets or numbers, but it's better if you can demonstrate this in a graphic, and it's just easier to understand, and it also helps to show how professional you are, that you actually know how this is going to work. Here's a couple more diagrams. These are more complicated, but again, this is helpful to have a diagram because trying to do this in words would be a lot more confusing. Okay, so this is online food delivery. Here's one that's in Japanese. You can kind of, even though you don't speak the language, you can kind of get the idea of a little bit behind it based on the pictures. Here's a more complicated one for Airbnb. So the reason that we do these diagrams is because when you try to describe it in words, very quickly people stop listening and they're thinking about some question that they're not sure about. So for example, with Airbnb, if you're describing it in words, very quickly someone's trying to think, well, how much is the Airbnb getting from the host, and how much is the guest paying them? And so having a bit of a diagram here helps to anticipate some of the questions and maybe answer them in the order that the reader is thinking about them. So that's another benefit of these graphics. Here's one that's pretty complicated. Imagine trying to describe this in words. This is kind of a peer-to-peer insurance business model. Now, I've talked about business models, but you can also use graphics, and we're going to talk about some metrics that I'd like you to use or be able to calculate. You can use graphics in many parts of the business plan. In your operations section, you would probably want to be able to understand what are the major costs that are involved in your business. So this is really nice. It's like a Starbucks cup, and then shows different portions of that cup that go to different parts of the cost of the business. This is one that this is a explanation of costs comparing with different types of competing technologies. So you could put that in the product comparison that we talked about before up front at the business plan, or potentially it could go in operations. It just kind of depends on how you want to do that. But this is a great comparison. I like this image here because you're comparing this reusable filter to a K-cup, and some of these metrics are very important. So I would probably put these two images up in the product description area, but you're going to need to calculate these numbers, and that's going to be related to operations, so it could go under operations. Here's another example, very similar. This might be, you might have a couple different tables that are have a different angle on trying to show how competitive your product is. This one is focused on costs, and so you could potentially put that in operations as well. Here's another image. Again, yeah, I just like the idea that you can compare these, compare costs across different products, and do it in a graphical way. You see they use number of cups here as a way of indicating quantity. Here's another image. Now I'm showing all of these images because I just want to reiterate, like hit you over the head, that we want to make this business plan look like closer to a brochure or magazine than English essay. You want to have images that that explain what you're trying to say rather than trying to do it with a bunch of words. Okay, so we're going to stop right there, and I'll come back for the next part.